The storm had raged for hours, turning the world outside into a howling, frozen expanse. The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, piling up in drifts against the windows of the small cabin nestled on the edge of the forest. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls, and the faint scent of pine lingered in the air. In the flickering light, Nathan sat in his favorite armchair, a steaming mug of coffee resting on the side table next to him. He was used to these long, solitary nights. Living alone in the wilderness had its challenges, but it also brought a peace that was hard to come by elsewhere. Outside, the wind shrieked through the trees, rattling the walls of the cabin as if nature itself were trying to break in. Nathan had been reading, lost in the pages of an old novel, when a soft scratching sound interrupted his thoughts. At first, he thought it was the wind, twisting the branches of the trees against the wooden structure. But the scratching persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. His heart quickened in response. He rose from his chair, a sense of unease settling over him. Living in the wilderness meant you learned to trust your instincts, and something about this sound didn't sit right. He crossed the cabin silently, his bare feet padding against the wooden floor, and approached the door. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a faint, pitiful whine, a noise so small and desperate it seemed out of place amidst the storm's fury. Nathan hesitated for only a moment before his hand gripped the door handle, curiosity and concern battling inside him. As he opened the door, a gust of icy wind slapped him across the face, but it was what stood before him that froze him to the core. A lynx, its fur matted with snow, its body trembling violently, stood on the doorstep, eyes wide with fear and desperation. Nathan didn't hesitate. Without thinking, he dropped the flashlight he had been holding and reached out to scoop the lynx into his arms. Its body was cold, far colder than he had expected, stiff from the freezing temperatures. Its fur was heavy with snow, and the animal's ribs pressed sharply against his chest, a painful reminder of how long it had been out in the storm. The lynx's body trembled, weak and fragile, and its amber eyes locked onto his with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. "Hang on," Nathan whispered, his voice strained, and he carried the animal inside, slamming the door shut behind them. He laid the lynx on the rug near the fire, the warmth of the flames dancing in the creature's fur. The lynx didn't move. Its shallow breaths were a slight rise and fall beneath its matted coat, but that was all. For a moment, Nathan feared it was too late, that the cold had already claimed it. He hurried into the kitchen, his mind racing. He needed to act fast. He filled a bowl with lukewarm water and grabbed a towel, returning to the lynx's side. Kneeling down, he gently started to rub the animal's fur, trying to bring back warmth to its frozen body. The lynx's eyes fluttered slightly, its ears twitching as Nathan worked. It was a small sign, but it gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, the creature wasn't beyond saving. His mind raced with questions. Where had it come from? How long had it been trapped in the storm? And why had it chosen his cabin of all places? It was a mystery that gnawed at him, but there was little time to dwell on it. He focused on the lynx, his hands shaking as he worked to melt the ice from its fur, trying to coax the creature back to life. The storm outside intensified, rattling the cabin's walls, as if nature itself were warning him that this was no ordinary night. Nathan kept rubbing, every motion slow and deliberate, trying to restore circulation to the animal's limbs. The lynx's body trembled less with each passing minute, its fur softening as the ice melted away. Nathan didn't stop, he couldn't. Something inside him told him that this creature was special, that its arrival was no accident. Slowly, the lynx began to stir. Its eyes opened fully, meeting his gaze for a brief moment. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. There was a depth in those eyes, a weariness, yes, but also a flicker of gratitude, as if it understood what he was trying to do. He spoke softly to it, offering reassurance, though he wasn't sure the lynx could hear him. "You're safe now. You'll be okay." Hours passed in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional rumble of the storm. The room grew warmer as the night dragged on, and the lynx's breathing became more even, less labored. Nathan kept vigil, watching over it, wondering what had driven the animal to him. Was it simply the storm that had brought it here, or was there something more? Something about this encounter felt important, as if their meeting was more than chance. As dawn approached, the first light of morning crept through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. The lynx, though still weak, seemed to be recovering. It lifted its head slightly, its amber eyes studying Nathan with a new sense of awareness. The storm outside had begun to subside, but Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that the storm was only a prelude to something larger. Suddenly, a soft scratching sound broke the silence. It came from the door. Nathan's pulse quickened. Could it be another animal in need? Or something else, something far more unsettling? The lynx's ears pricked up at the sound, its body tense, as if it too understood that something was amiss. Nathan's heart pounded as he rose to his feet, his mind racing. The storm outside had finally started to calm, but now, the soft scratching from the door had returned, sharp and persistent. He glanced down at the lynx, whose eyes were wide, its body tense with an unspoken alertness. The lynx's ears flicked toward the sound, and its body shifted slightly, as if preparing to move, though it was still too weak. He hesitated for a moment, torn between the need to investigate and the lingering fear that whatever was outside could pose a danger to both of them. He crossed the room slowly, his breath caught in his chest. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was not the wind. It was too deliberate. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly, and opened it just a crack, enough to peer out into the pale light of dawn. The cold air slammed into him like a blow, but Nathan barely noticed. His gaze swept the yard, scanning the snow-covered ground for movement. For a moment, there was nothing, only the untouched blanket of snow stretching out toward the forest. But then, he saw it, a shadow in the distance, moving quickly, with purpose. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as the shape drew closer. Another lynx. This one was smaller, younger, and its coat, though matted with snow, was not as worn as the older one inside. Nathan's stomach twisted. The young lynx stopped at the doorstep, its eyes wide and desperate. It let out a soft, pitiful whine, its body trembling from the cold. It didn't growl or shy away. Instead, it mirrored the same look of silent plea he had seen in the older lynx's eyes, a desperate cry for help. The sight was enough to freeze him in place. Two lynxes, both in critical condition, had come to his doorstep in the dead of night, during a brutal snowstorm. It couldn't be coincidence. Something far darker, something more intentional, was at play. Nathan took a deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. He couldn't leave the young lynx out there, not in this storm. Slowly, he opened the door wider, ushering the smaller creature inside. As soon as the young lynx crossed the threshold, the older one inside stirred. Its eyes, still faint with exhaustion, flicked toward the newcomer. Its ears twitched, and with a slight movement of its tail, it rose just enough to sniff the air. There was a moment of recognition between the two animals, a connection that went beyond words. The younger lynx hesitated before stepping closer to the older one. It curled up beside the larger creature, resting its head against its side, seeking warmth and comfort. Nathan stood still, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. These two weren't just random animals. They were family. They had come here together, and now they were safe. But why had they come? The answer gnawed at him, pulling at the edges of his thoughts like a dark thread. He glanced outside, his gaze drifting back to the forest's edge. Was someone out there, watching them? Had these lynxes been driven here for a reason, by a force beyond the storm? The sound of the storm waning outside did little to ease the knot in his stomach. As he knelt beside them, his hand gently resting on the older lynx's head, Nathan knew that whatever had brought them here, whatever had been chasing them, was far from over. And somehow, he was about to be pulled into it. Nathan sat quietly, watching the two lynxes huddled together on the rug, their bodies warm from the fire and the blanket he had draped over them. The older lynx's breathing had steadied, and the younger one, though still weak, seemed comforted by the presence of its companion. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival had been more than just a stroke of fate. There was a story behind their journey, something dark and unsettling. The room felt heavy with unspoken questions. Where had they come from? What had driven them to seek shelter here? Nathan's eyes flicked to the window, where the morning light now bathed the landscape in a soft glow. The storm outside had finally subsided, but the silence it left behind felt unnatural, too quiet. He stood slowly, glancing down at the lynxes, as though seeking answers in their gaze. The older lynx stirred again, its amber eyes locking onto his with a knowing intensity. It was as if it understood what was at stake, that their safety was not guaranteed just because they were inside his cabin. There was something out there, something that had pushed them to his door. Nathan's stomach churned with unease. He had to find out what that something was, what had hunted these animals across the storm, to his doorstep. And whether or not it was still out there, waiting. The question echoed in his mind: what was hunting them, and why had they come to him? Nathan grabbed his coat and boots, a sense of urgency now pulling him outside. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. There was more to this than just a storm. He needed answers. The lynxes had found their way to his door for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't over. As he stepped into the cold, his breath forming clouds in the still air, he followed the faint tracks left by the lynxes, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The fresh snow was untouched except for their paw prints, but there, near the edge of the forest, he spotted something, a deep, heavy mark in the snow, larger than any animal's. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone out here. Whatever had chased the lynxes was still close, still watching. Nathan swallowed hard, knowing that the answers he sought were hidden in the wilderness, just beyond his reach. And he would have to face whatever it was, head on. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.